Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. On our panel today, we've got AJ O'Neill. Hey, AJ.
Yo, 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 coming at you live from tactile keyboard switches.
That's a fad that I never actually got, but I know that people really get excited about it, so good for you.
Well, it's just
Uh,
it's just the tester board.
okay. And another panelist on today is Steve Edwards. How are you, Steve?
Been busier than a one-legged man at a butt kicking contest this morning, but hello from cold and rainy Portland.
Hello, Steve. By the way, just so you know that I'm sitting here with the window open because the weather is really nice here. And
Thank
I
you for that.
am,
I appreciate
yeah,
that.
yeah, there are other issues as well. Unfortunately, there are other issues. So for those of you who don't remember, I'm coming from Tel Aviv, which is in Israel, which is at war, which is in fun, to say the least. And our guest today is Andreas Møller. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes, pretty much. Yeah.
S
Yeah, I'm coming at you from Copenhagen, Denmark.
Wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen. Let's see who gets the reference. Everybody is probably way too young. Anyway, so Andreas, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do. We like to ask people while they're famous, or they think they're famous.
I am pretty convinced I'm not famous. I'm pretty sure
Yet,
I'm not.
but
Yet,
once
at
you're on
least.
here, then your fame increases and you start getting autograph
Oh, I
requests.
mean, for
We've heard that from
sure.
multiple
Yeah.
people in the past.
Yeah.
So,
No, I expect that. So, well, in
Family
that case,
members, Steve?
I am, well,
no,
I'm famous because I was on the JavaScript Jabber podcast, which is where people will know me from, I think. Yeah, I'm a software engineer that's been building web applications for what is probably a little bit over 2 decades now, and work with a ton of different frameworks, ton of different stacks and technologies, always with a lot of focus on web because I always found it kind of to be the most fun platform. The fact that you can deploy apps right away has just always been fantastic.
Well, it used to be the
Um,
case. Now there's all sorts of building and packaging and bundling and transpiling and whatnot getting in the way.
if only there was a way to get out of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be what
Uh,
we're going to be talking about today, no?
Foreshadowing. Um, yeah. Yeah, I've been always working with the web, and in the most recent couple of years, I've been sort of obsessed with this idea. If there's at least in my book, a better way of building web applications, like something that lets you ship faster, lets you work faster, and sort of more seamlessly. And we've seen a ton of sort of progress in this space, I think, over the last, especially 5 years, actually, but also the last 10 years. Like a lot have happened, right? And most recently, a lot of the new build tools and hosting platforms has just made this process so much easier. But there's every time you make a progress, there's like you can see the next step, you can see the next place you want to go to, right? Um, so for me, the sort of meant is there a way to build applications faster? And I spend most of my time building the front end part of applications. So specifically, is there a way to build UI faster for web applications? And that sort of led me to start Toddle, which is a platform for building web applications without actually writing code. So you build all the UI in the Toddle editor, just like you would do in a tool like Webflow or any sort of similar tools to that. But what set Toddle a little bit apart is the fact that you can build the UI in Toddle, but you can also actually build the logic and all the data fetching and everything else in Toddle. So you never have to leave that tool. You can build the entire application then. And that is actually, you can do all these things without actually having to write any code to make that happen.
Yeah, so no code and low code have been quite the rage in recent years, it seems to me. Um, it's kind of like it's if our market is kind of splitting. Some people are betting on meta frameworks and frameworks and meta frameworks which are really heavy into the coding part, You write your UI as lines of code. Um, Others are, like you said, are betting on a no code or low code approach of dragging and dropping their way to a web application, a website or web application. And by the way, I mentioned people who have listened to this podcast probably know that I used to work at Wix up until 2 years ago, which is very much in this space as well. Its main focus, though, is on the visual building of the websites. Only recently has it also started, starting to target a similar place that you seem to be at, which is building actual business logic on top of the user interface that gets constructed. Um, so I looked at the Toddle website and I looked at some of your demos and videos and whatnot. And what got me really interesting is less the visual editing part. I mean, it's really cool the fact that you can build a user interface with drag and drop, like a bit like you do with like you said with Webflow or maybe with Figma, and then somehow translate it into an actual web application or website or web page. But what got me more interested is the way that you implement business logic in a no code type approach. Your ability to actually specify interactivity and computational parts. And one of the videos that I saw was you actually using your tool to do like coding challenges. So it's really using a no code tool to implement to
Hmm.
solve coding challenges.
Wait,
So
how's that work?
yeah, exactly.
Are
And
we
that's
advent of coding with a visual editor?
Yeah, that was exactly. I only did the 1st of December, and I released it on the 4th of December to make sure that I was not like giving away anything. Um, but essentially, just showing that the flexibility of Toddle's, especially logic engine, means that you can solve advent of code challenges in Toddle, and again, you could do it without writing code. Um,
That's the headliner right there.
Yeah, but it's not exactly not writing code. It's you're kind of drawing code, as it were. I mean, it's NP complete, I think, for those, more technically minded of our listeners, correct?
yes.
So can you explain that?
Well, so I think this is not entirely new. I realized before we did that someone had done it in Sketch, the visual programming language for children. So we're not exactly the first tool to do that. I think it still surprises a lot of people that it's possible, often because it's not really what we associate. We don't associate visual programming with anything complex. It's generally used, and I think this actually kind of applies to a lot of no code. Most people see it as tools for people who can't code. And so, if you know how to code, why would you ever touch one of those, right? It seems unnecessary. But I think what we're seeing in the more recent years is that there's actually really a point to that, and there's a power and a flexibility in this that rivals code. You can do all the same thing, and I think you said sort of, well, it is kind of code, and I think you're right. I like making the distinction that it's programming, but it's not code. Um,
So there's my wife is an accountant, and she can't write a Visual Basic script to save her life. It doesn't make sense to her. She will, copy and paste something off of the internet, but like the very idea of indentation being a way to logically group something, like she's done PowerPoint presentations, she's done bullet points, but for some reason like that it just doesn't. Maybe it's a mental block. I don't know. I would say that she is smart enough and capable enough to be able to decide a logical flow, but she no text she couldn't do it. So I'm wondering if maybe this could open up an avenue for people like that where I don't understand it, but like just can't grasp the textual representation maybe could grasp like a nested flow representation.
Yes, I mean we're seeing that all the time. So I think there's a very big benefit, which is that it just looks a lot less scary. And the thing is, like when you've been coding for a long time, you kind of forget what it was like. Like you forget the early days. My wife
I'll
actually
never
literally
forget
just
PHP.
no, but you might forget some of the journey of learning it, right? I mean, my
You-
my wife just trained to be a programmer. She just got a job last year as a front end developer, which is super ironic now that I'm trying to move the industry away from it. But it sort of as an opportunity for me to go back and see, like, oh yeah, it was really hard to figure out how variable bindings work and why this value is there now and not before. It's just you forgot because you've been thinking about it for years. You've just been thinking in a certain way. Um,
it's really interesting, you know. I kind of like to compare coding to the way that lawyers write contracts. You know, we need to describe something in a super precise way, and but it still needs to be kind of readable and writable by humans. So lawyers in contracts invented like they took the English language and they kind of twisted it so it's still English, but it's not the English that you would write as a normal person. It's contract English, you know, party of the first part, party of the second part, and so forth. We as programmers took it a step further. We went further away from human languages to something that's, you know, more alien to most people, which is why I think a lot of people really struggle with it. Like, you know, the way that it executes the whole line after line that seems to make perfect sense to us is really challenging to a lot of people that are not from this space. Now, you know, we try to explain it by saying it's like a cookbook recipe or stuff like that, or the instructions that you might get from IKEA, but that just scares people even more. but but yeah, but so talking about Toddle instead of code, which you know most of our listeners I assume know how code looks like. Now, obviously, this is a podcast. This is not a visual medium, so it's kind of challenging. But can you try to describe how Toddle programming looks and feels like?
yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that are a little bit different with Toddle than other sort of previous visual programming languages is that in Toddle we kind of split programming into three separate parts. So there's the first part, as you mentioned, the visual building, which is just building UI and essentially saying I want a div and a button inside the div, and it needs some attributes, and I need to apply some styling. And it is all, if people are familiar with Webflow, it's pretty much exactly the same thing you're doing in Webflow, right? So that's kind of one editor, one part of it. Then we have workflows, which are essentially large flowcharts. And they come in every time you have a set of actions you want performed. So let's say when a user clicks a button, you can attach a workflow and say, I want you to do this. If this, then do that. Otherwise, do that. Then do this bit, right? Very sort of flowchart style execution. And it's visually built to look like a flowchart, right? It's got our own spin on it. But I mean, if you read a flowchart, you kind of immediately understand what's going on there, right? And if you're familiar with functional programming paradigms, this is sort of everything that has a side effect is an action in Toddle. So flowcharts are like actions, all like do this side effect, then do that side effect, then do that side effect. So it can be update a variable, it can be call an API, it can be set page title, anything that where you're sort of making a change in your system, that's an action. And the third part is then the formula editor. And again, this is very much borrowing from functional programming. Formulas are entirely pure. I say entirely, we do have a few like date and time and now. So we're not entirely strict to that process, but there's at least no side effects. So there's only ever like computer value. And this looks, if anybody's ever done Blender, or like 3D, any sort of 3D tool, you know that there's like a material section for do that. This might not be all of your listeners, but if you ever seen any like 3D tool, you realize that actually visual programming is huge in the 3D space. When people are building materials and assigning material like different kind of nodes, they're always doing these massive like computation graphs. And in this space, like visual programming is entirely dominant, right? Nobody's writing code for this. I never really understood why. I think the basic reason is just that um, people didn't, like most material artists, didn't know how to code, so it was easy to build a visual interface, right? But some of these can be incredibly complex in the 3D world. And Toddles visually look the same. It's a bunch of nodes with graphs in between, and it's essentially function calls. It's essentially like just like you would have a JavaScript function. It produces one output, takes any number of inputs. This is the same thing, just arranged as a big graph, where on the right side you'll get your output, and then every node can have one or more inputs, and you have this big tree graph structure. That's your computation graph, right?
Now, so I have a couple of questions about that. I'm thinking about where to start. Okay, so one thing that I remember from looking at your demos and also your videos is that there's a strong reactive aspect to the way that you work. So you talked about actions being side effects, but what I saw is that very often that side effect is actually update a variable, where a
Yeah,
variable is basically just a named value that can change.
yeah,
And whenever a variable changes, that variable is bound to things. So it might be bound to some aspect of the user interface, for example, or it might be bound to other computations, maybe. And whenever you update the variable, then everything that is bound to that variable automatically changes accordingly.
yeah. That's correct. And so the basic model here we use for how Toddle works is exactly the same you'd see in React or Vue or Angular today, right? The underlying premises are different between each framework, but the general idea is the same, right? You have some state, you have either from variables or maybe from an API, and then every time that changes, you update the UI automatically, right? Each platform has a slightly different mechanism in which that happens, but the overall concept is the same. And again, that's the same model we adopted to Toddle, right? So we tried not to reinvent everything about web development. We're kind of just saying, what is that dominant component architecture that has won so that pretty much every modern framework uses exactly the same idea today, right? And how can we apply that into a visual development context?
So, a few questions about that. So, first of all, just to understand the scope of what you're doing, everything is running client side, correct? You don't actually code the backend, or do you?
No, we Toddle is front end only. So it's set up to work with whatever backend you provide. And there's actually quite a few like no code backends you can use as well. But a lot of them are a little bit newer. So I think for larger projects, most of our customers are still coding the backend.
And you basically just access the backend via Ajax calls. So, an action might be an Ajax call that either sends some data or retrieves some data and then uses it to update whatever part of the user interface.
Yeah.
So in terms of backends, from what I was seeing on your list there, it looks like it's stuff that's like headless CMSs that are hosted elsewhere. Can you build in your own, say you wanted to you have your own custom MySQL database for a backend? Is that something you can do as well?
Yeah. So Toddle just communicates over REST. So it really works with any backend you want. Like you can code your own, you can use one of the no code ones that are established. But like as long as it's speak, you can talk to it over an HTTP API, you can use it the Toddle.
So how does it work with local development? Is this, I mean, you have everything is done on the toddle.dev site. That's where your editing happens, or is there something you can do locally, like if you're working with a local copy of a database?
I mean, so you could set up Toddle so that it would change based on parameters to redirect to different backends.
Mhm.
So you could say, for example, I would like to use a different base URL for these requests based on whether you're setting some local storage state or whatever you're doing.
Mhm.
But there's no local version of Toddle. That all runs in the cloud on Toddle at Dev.
So you could, in theory, you could set up something like an ngrok URL that's open to the outside and communicate with your REST API that way.
Yeah, as long as it's reachable from Toddle's backend, right?
Right.
Toddle servers, right?
Yeah, although to be fair, I would imagine such a solution, the more popular approach would be to use some sort of a headless CMS rather than trying
Right.
to run a local database or something like that. So even during development, you're working with a cloud-based service or something like that.
Okay, so this is my geek things coming to mind as a developer. Since I live inside debugging, I'm just thinking about recent hours I spent debugging something because I was able to run everything locally. How does that work? Are you stuck with strictly like log files? Is there a way to use breakpoints and just access through your web dev tools when you're not
I,
local, or how does debugging going to work in a case like this?
Before Andreas answers, I just have to say that you beat me to the punch because that was exactly going to be my next question. How does debugging work in a visual coding type environment?
So, yeah, it's a great question. And we don't have a particularly complex debugging setup yet. It's something we've got in the pipeline, but we haven't really needed it very much yet. And that's because quite a lot of times the browser's debugging tools work for like very complex issues. But also, Toddle itself, the way the formula editor, as we call it, works, is that you're always working with live data. So as you're building your formulas, you're always seeing the next value that you're producing. And it's very similar in a way to coding in a Rebel, uh, where you're sort of writing each line at a time. Similar here, you see all the data all the time. So when code, we sort of have a tendency to, code for about 10 minutes or maybe 20 if we're getting comfortable with TypeScript or something like that. We'll go and code and then we'll see how it works. And then eventually we'll go and figure out why it didn't work, right? Um, but in Toddle, you're really running every part of your code all the time. So you have a tendency to catch things really early. Um, so we haven't really had a lot of need for it yet, and therefore we haven't really prioritized it too much. As we sort of go on, obviously there are cases where we now end up debugging issues by adding log statements, etc., where you could definitely improve on that. But we
Yeah, I
just
would.
don't. We're not seeing it that much on the front end, to be honest.
Yeah, to be honest, you could probably add some sort of a simple log if you don't have it already. Could probably add a simple logging mechanism into Toddle so that certain actions, like you said, an action is a side effect, and the side effect might be log. So you
Yeah,
could easily add an action that either logs locally into the DevTools console or sends it to some sort of a telemetry service to be collected, for sessions in general, stuff like that. You probably want to have some sort of telemetry service at one point or another in any event. Um,
we have a log to console action that we use quite rigorously right now, and it's quite easy because again, it's mostly pure functions, almost always pure functions you're working with or formulas, right? You can really just copy part of a formula over and log it out, and you can be quite confident that it's going to generate the same result. So logging is sort of our main approach to debugging when needed, right? But again, because it's easy to build UI, sometimes you're just like you'll just add like a paragraph into the page and write it there, because then you can kind of track it in real time, right? So if I'm doing like more complex mouse interactions, like a some sort of swipe demo or something, right? I'm often just logging values live to the UI. I'll throw in a span and put whatever my mouth offset is in there, and then I can sort of figure out, okay, why is this not working? And as I'm dragging the mouse around, I can see, okay, it's not setting it here, or I forgot to subtract some window width, or whatever it is, the problems you always run into when trying to do math. Right?
so, um, pulling back a bit, Can you talk us about, like, through the process of how you actually start using Toddle? Like, let's say I'm saying, okay, this sounds really cool. I want to try it out. What what do I do?
So you can simply go to our website and sign up right now. So there's a free tier that's sort of
So it's
lets you
toddle.dev,
build.
correct?
Yeah, you go to toddle.dev and you can sign up right there. And then get started building a new project. We have a little tutorial project that's kind of a project built in Toddle that also at the same time explains to you, like there's also a website that explains how to build projects in Toddle. So you sort of go between interacting with it and editing it to get to the next level all the time to figure out how does this actually work. And each page in that application teaches you a new concept, right? Um, and after that, I would say if you want to really dive in and understand more, we have a ton of videos on YouTube, both of us explaining different concepts, but also a lot of us just building applications in Toddle and showing how to achieve different things.
Cool. And what you described is free, correct? If I'm just building a
Yeah,
demo website, and the restriction is that that demo website is hosted on your own platform, correct?
yeah, yeah. So it'll be hosted on our domain. You'll get a subdomain of .toddle.site. If you then upgrade to paid tier, then you can add your own domain and also remove our little branding logo on the bottom of the app. Right?
So, so purchasing the, let's call it the premium plan, basically gets rid of the on-page advertising and gets you your own domain. That you can
Exactly.
basically, I purchase a domain somewhere and I can associate it with the total website that I've built.
Exactly.
Anything else that I can purchase?
Well, so we have different plans. The initial starter plans are for we sort of price that quite low at $20 per user. And the idea here is for small startups to get started and start building in Total, right?
So wait a minute, it's $20 per user, not per website or something like that?
No, it's
It's
$20 per month for up to 3 users, and then you pay
yeah,
$16 a month if you do it annually.
yeah. But that is also today per project. So if you
Ah,
have
okay.
multiple projects, you need to be that needs to be on
Hmm.
a paid plan. You're paying for each. Um,
Okay.
So I have a question. What is the tool set used to build Toddle? What's your tech stack?
ah, well, that's my favorite question because well, there's quite a few things. Our database is hosted by Superbase, which is also where we get authentication, a few other things. So we're running our whole data off Superbase. Then we have sort of a backend slash middle backend. I don't know if this needs a new word or have one I'm not familiar with, but we're running on Cloudflare workers. We use them for two things. We both use them for server rendering applications because obviously we're storing total code, if you will. It's like a JSON format we store all the data in, right? Um, and that needs to be rendered out as HTML. And we do that on Cloudflare workers, so it's very close to the user always, right? And Cloudflare is also kind of our backend for the Toddle editor. So we use a feature they have called durable objects that lets you essentially create a singleton instance of a data store where you can in memory store a lot of information. And then you can connect to that with WebSockets. And it kind of have this property where there can only ever be once globally, one instance of that globally. So when you create a branch of your product or a project, you'll connect to your instance of the server, which in memory keeps all the files up to date. So that means we can get things like live collaboration going by just having people write to that. And we can actually solve a lot of concurrency issues by having the server close to people and just saying, well, the latest write wins because there's never more than a few milliseconds latency between the user and the durable object. So that's sort of the backend part. All of the front end, the whole editor, our website, our blog, everything is built in Toddle. So we built the whole project in the project itself.
Nice. That's way cool.
That's very cool indeed. So you mean
Yeah.
all the complex logic of of the editing process and whatnot, all of that is actually done in your visual programming language.
Yes. Everything from like the left panel sidebar where you're showing all the element trees with all the different nodes and all the drag and drop interactions of those. The formula editor where you can space pan around and zoom in and out while also editing these nodes that are aligning themselves. Everything is built in Toddle, that project.
So I think the
That
correct phrase is that you're eating your own dog food. Is that correct?
It's such a negative term though, isn't it? But
I
yes,
don't
I
think
think so.
so. I think that's.
Dog
But
feeding.
have you
I
had
don't think
dog
that's
food?
negative.
Well, judging by some of the ads I've seen of some newer dog foods, it might not be so bad anymore.
Oh,
There's some
okay.
good quality stuff out there. So depends on what you're eating, I guess.
but it definitely highlights the fact that this tool is powerful. I mean, if you're able to build Toddle, then anything that a user might want to build is probably covered. Um,
Yeah, I would say I've been working on a lot of projects. I used to do a lot of contracting. I lived in London for like 6 years and jumped company every 6 months because when you're young, that's really fun. And I've been working on anything from small startups to like enterprise companies, and I don't think I've ever built anything as complicated as a no-code editor like this. Right? This is in pure complexity. This is by far the worst because there's so many things. Like you only ever work with recursive data structures, right? There's the only everything's a tree, everything's like recursion, everything is like trying to figure out how does it work when you have like 500 components on the screen at the same time, because these editor interfaces are very complex, right?
yeah,
So yeah.
A lot of
I,
programming
I
is
I
the
know
worst.
I know what you mean. As I said, I've worked at Wix. I've worked on the Wix editor. The Wix editor is a huge application, it's one of the largest I've ever worked on. It is actually implemented in React, and it's uh, hundreds of thousands of lines of code. Um,
Yeah.
but to be fair, Wix actually does a lot of dog fooding as well. So the editor is built on native, but a lot of the interfaces there are built using Wix, and I think that the same is true for Webflow. And I really dig this approach because it really shows that you're serious about the tool you're building when you're able to use it for that sort of a thing. But it does bring me to another question. When you start thinking code, you start thinking version control. Uh,
Yes.
how do you do version control in Toddle?
Well, so that was one of the things I had a lot when I started this project was that there's all these different things that needs to happen for this to work. And when I say work, I mean work for me, right? You can build a no-code tool that lets you do version control, and most of them have some version of that, but it's usually the live version and the development version, right?
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm coming from teams of like 5 if it's a small team, or 20 people for large teams, and like that is never going to work, right? And live collaborations all cool, but the reality is we don't use it very much because people work asynchronously, right? So you need essentially something like a Git style version control if you want to be able to work in a team. And like we're a small team at Toddle, but we're still pushing like new features all the time, and we're working asynchronously. So unfortunately, Git is kind of tied to lines of code. So Git wasn't really an option, or at least I couldn't find any way to make that work based on a different kind of diffing, right? You need a different diffing algorithm when you're working with a JSON data structure compared to just lines of code. So we had to build our own, and we actually built it in procedural SQL because we wanted it to run directly in our database, so that we could essentially store all our files. So when we're storing files in Superbase, we have a table called blobs, which is stolen exactly from Git. I spent like a couple of months trying to figure out, well, maybe weeks, maybe it was months, trying to figure out how Git actually works. like going around looking up like little hash keys and how do I git ls all these things and git cat or what are they called, right? To try and figure out what is the actual storage model and how does this work, and then replicate it like probably 3% of that, which is a lot, right? Because Git is massive, right? Um, but it's the same basic concept. Like all files are stored based on the hash of their content, so that you can store these snapshots all the time of your files without actually, and like a snapshot can be the whole project, but you don't have to double write files that hasn't changed, right? And since we don't actually ever do, like users never do a manual commit, what we do instead is that every time you save, we basically start a throttled save commit timer. So it automatically commits every 10 seconds if you're making changes. And then every one of these becomes a snapshot in the database that has a reference to these content index files, right?
It's interesting because last few episodes back, we actually had, I forget his name. I'll remember in a second. The guy from bit.dev. Uh, it was Gilad Shoham from
Mm.
bit.dev. Uh, and uh, and they also kind of have their own substitute for Git for a different reason, even though there is a certain amount of similarity in a sense. But it's interesting to see people coming up with Git alternatives effectively for various reasons. Although I'm not sure the term alternative is the correct one because you're not coming to a regular project and saying, "Hey, use this instead of Git." You're using Git for your own very special use case,
Yeah.
which I appreciate.
Oh, I
Um,
mean, if I could have used Git, I would absolutely have used Git. I would not have gone down this road if I had an alternative, right?
but you still have the possibility to like go back to a previous revision or version, or maybe even do something like a diff between, you know, or bisecting or stuff like that. All this, all the good stuff that people associate with visual editing, with
Yeah.
not visual editing, with source control. I mean, sorry.
Yeah. We have a somewhat limited set. Like obviously we're not in implementing all of Git, right? So we made some high level decisions that at least for now seems to work just fine. So it's always trunk based. You're only ever merging out from like branching out from the main branch and only ever merging into the main branch, right? Um, and that sort of lets you push real quick, like frequently. And that seems to work just fine. That was kind of similar to the workflow we used to have when working in code as well.
By
So
the
for
way,
now, we're sort of we're doing some shortcuts compared to a full Git setup, right?
yeah. By the way, it is worth mentioning that Linus Torvalds actually wrote Git in like a weekend, and so so people, you know, people know him for Linux, but they should know him for Git. Uh, it's a
Well, it
pretty
took me
amazing.
longer to copy it than it took him to write it. Then,
Yeah, he basically was committing Git into Git by the beginning of the week or something like that. Yeah, it's an interesting story. He's quite the guy. Um, yeah. So, how big do your flowcharts get?
well, interesting. The flowcharts, which is sort of in us the action part, they never get very big. I think the biggest we have is something like 20 nodes or so. Like they're not that complex. And that's because again, we all the actual computation logic is moved into formulas, right? So we have this separation. But the actual steps is like if this then do that. Each of these workflows are like one action happening when you, for example, you click a button. So if you end up taking a look at like let's say your React code and go, well, how many things am I doing when I click this button? The reality is you're rarely doing that many. Most of the lines are in order to compute a value, and then some of them actually are invoking side effects, right? So the flowcharts are usually quite small. We actually in our UI we actually have a very small window initially dedicated to them because that sort of sits on top of the editor. because most of them are just two or three actions in a row, or even one is the most popular, right? Most of the time, it's just when you click this button, do this one thing, or do these two things, or these three things. And so most of them are really, really simple. The more complex one, again, it never gets out of hand for them. Formulas are kind of a little bit different. We have some formulas in Toddle that are definitely not small. Um, but we also have the options of like you can go and say this part of the logic, I can extract that inside into what we call a component formula, and then essentially give it a name, right? So you have all the same, just like you wouldn't write all this in one function in JavaScript, you can do the same in Toddle. So I'm going to extract this, assign that a name, so this thing is manageable, right?
And so effectively you only view one flow chart at a time, really, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
So a quote unquote program might have a lot of flowcharts in it, but each one of them would be small, and you only view each flowchart by itself. But you can nest flowcharts by associating flowcharts with functions.
Yeah, we don't really have anything we specifically call functions. We sort of functions are at us divided into actions and formulas.
No,
Again,
I
based on
meant
what it's.
formula. I meant
Okay, yeah,
formula.
yeah. Also,
Um,
yeah,
yeah. By the way, so a question about that. I mean, over the years, there has been a lot of research into visual programming. Most of it, by the way, from what I know, kind of failed. There have not been a whole lot of really successful visual programming environments. You might say that Smalltalk was a visual programming environment and that it succeeded, but it was actually based on code. And actual solutions, like you mentioned one that was like for kids. I know that there were a lot of attempts in that area. So my two questions, I guess, are: how did you come with your own unique model for doing it? Is it like based on research or just your ideas or what, or things that you've read elsewhere? And why do you think yours will succeed where so many previous attempts have, effectively failed?
that is a good question, and it's very, very true that this is like visual programming is not something where most programmers go, "Oh, that's definitely the future," because it's very definitely the past, right? And I think it's been fun when people come along. Oh, this is brand new. You gotta go. The earliest example I've found is 1976, so it's not that new. It's before we had visual operating systems. The first visual programming language was created. So there's nothing new about it, right? It's very much an elephant graveyard of a technology choice to get into. Um, but I think I at least have a theory as to why the other languages failed, or why this never really made it anywhere. And essentially, whether I'm right or not is probably going to determine, uh, the success. But my theory is that when you take a programming language and then translate it one to one into a visual programming language, which most of the attempts are, right? Sketch is also a good example of this, right? Which is the one I mentioned earlier, right? When you try to do it one to one, what you end up with is a programming language that takes up a lot more screen space than code. And so, and Toddle has the same feature or problem depending on your perspective, right? It takes a lot more space on screen for something that, like, what would essentially be like 4 or 5 lines of code will take up an entire screen in total. And if you start then going through your code and saying, well, if I needed an entire screen for every 4 or 5 lines of code, it's very clear why that's not a particularly good setup, right? So the trick to visual
Uh,
programming.
I
Oh,
I'll interrupt you for a second just to make it clear for our listeners why this is the case. One example that I saw in your demos was the simple if statement. That in code, if is literally like 4 lines of code. If condition, then something else. So that's literally like 4 lines of code. And in your case, it's a box and a line and a box and a line. So obviously, all that visual representation takes much more screen area than, like you said, than just four lines of code.
Yeah. And it's kind of the same thing as with code. If the fits on the screen, it's a lot easier to understand than if you have to start navigating, right? Once functions start to not fit on a single screen anymore, they start to get a lot more complicated to work with. It's not the only dimension, but it's a pretty good indication. And the same thing is true for visual programming. So if you just translate code one to one to a visual medium, you'll just have you'll do a lot of panning all the time, and that's the worst possible way to find anything, right? That's never going to work. So the trick is the trick, at least what Toddle does, is always to try and say, when can we break this up into smaller parts that are easy to navigate? And because we sort of broke up at like the actions, workflows, and the formulas here, it means that normally one workflow with 20 nodes might have been massive, right? It might have been take up like 100 screens or something, maybe not quite, but something along those lines, right? Because it just takes up so much space. But because you're navigating this visually and quite effectively, you don't have to look at all of it at a time. So you get to sort of break your program up into smaller bits and only like really easily navigate to the part of your code or visual code in this case that you need to work with. And that kind of lets us get away with using a lot more space for all of it because the tools we've given you to navigate your code, if you want to say it like, or your app, are a lot more efficient.
Hmm, interesting. And again, it has to do with the fact that you're never seeing the flow chart as a whole. It's never this one big flow chart. It's always a specific flow chart that's associated with a particular event leading to a particular action, let's say, through some formulas.
Yeah.
And I
You
guess also the reactive aspect is also a big help here because again, you split things and at the reactivity boundary.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, in terms of it's not entirely something. I mean, nothing is ever something you invented entirely, right? It's always based on a hundred other things. There was a lot of, as you probably heard already, me talking about functional probing. I think I took a lot of inspiration for that paradigm, exactly because it does make this hard split between what is in functional programming pure and impure. And it's a quite nice and quite sensible way to divide your program and actually saying, okay, when if I separate it into what is an action, what is a side effect, and what is not, there's it sort of becomes a nice logical boundary to split your program down, and that's a big part of why it works quite well.
And
Um,
actions, I assume, always work as if they're synchronous, correct?
yes, but an action can emit an event, which
Oh
is
yeah, for
essentially just
sure. But if
an
it's,
a
for example, it's waiting for, it's downloading data until you get the data, you won't proceed to
yeah.
the next step.
Yeah. So when they're listed sort of underneath each other in an action chain, they're executing synchronously. And if you want to wait for something, right, that action can then say, I'm going to emit an event eventually. And then you can start a new workflow off that.
Mm, okay, cool. So it's really, as you said, you were inspired by various things, but it was really your own invention.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on how much you're inspired, I suppose. It's definitely a new take. It's not entirely original. Like you can find a lot of examples of products and different kind of visual programming that are very similar in many ways, but I hadn't really seen anyone do it in the same way um for solving the same kind of problem.
So really, I have two more quick questions. One is, what's your solution for authentication? I mean, if you built Toddle with it, and obviously you have, I think you mentioned that you have authentication built in, but does it mean that also if I'm using Toddle for my own app, I can integrate authentication into it? Uh, and and the second question is any part of it open source?
Yes, good question. I'll take them in the order they're given then. So the way we handle authentication is that because we're front end only, we don't technically handle authentication, right? Authentication kind of have to live with your data, right? Because that's what you're authenticating and essentially limiting access to. So authentication is very much a backend problem. What we've done is essentially create a simple way for storing an authentication token as an HTTP only cookie. And then we have a proxy layer also on Cloudflare where you can proxy API requests to, and we can essentially just smack that token onto it, right? Um, so let's say you are making a request for your API, and for that to work, it needs to have a specific user token as an auth header, right? What you would do in Toddle is essentially you would first authenticate through your service and then either come back to Toddle via redirect, or you might be like username password login and then get a token back. And then you'd essentially tell Toddle to store that token, and we'll store it as an out token, and that'll be stored in HTTP only. So there's no, even if there's foreign scripts on the side, they're not going to be able to sniff that out because it's never actually sent back to the client again, right? And then when you're making an API request from Toddle, it first goes through our Cloudflare worker, and there you can then configure to say, I want to add this token in as authentication for this request, and then that'll make the authenticated request and come back with the data.
So you're using the Cloudflare worker as a sort of a segregation layer in this context. You're offloading
Yes,
the what needs to be secure off of the front end into the Cloudflare worker where third-party code can't access it. Interesting
exactly.
take.
That was not actually the point of doing that. It's just I really hate CORS issues.
Yeah.
That was the original point of saying, if I just add a real simple proxy here, I never have to deal with that again. And that sounds very nice. But actually, authentication became a really nice added solution there. And I think we're sort of looking at, can we build some more interesting, like right now, we cache response based on the server sent cache header, but we can see a lot of cases where it might actually be nice to be able to override that locally and say, I know the server said you can only cache for this long, but actually I would like you to cache for just a few seconds, or set some stale by validate for extra performance, right? So it's sort of adds on a lot of benefits that we can also tap into down the line.
Mm, cool. And about the open source part?
There's nothing right now that is open source. We are talking about it. I'm not quite sure. The main reason why it's not open source is actually just that we thought it would take longer to develop in public uh,
Mm,
than than private. And the other bit is we're quite tied into Cloudflare at this point, right? There's quite
yeah.
a lot of our tech stack that's built on Cloudflare, and I think we're probably going even further that way because there's a lot of the technology that just kind of fits really perfectly with this.
Well, there's an interesting argument on happening currently about how tied to Vercel is Next.js, and that's like kind of the quote unquote epitome of open source development environment. Yet it turns out at least that's what, for example, um, Kent wrote in his critique, that it's a lot of it is tied to Vercel services. But it is what it is.
For those
By
of
the
you
Um,
way,
listening at home, that is the
yeah,
epitome of.
epitome. Sorry.
it's okay. I said it epitome for a long time too because you read it and you never hear anyone say it.
Did you also say facade instead of facade? Were you one of those
No,
people?
but I said subtle. When I was in third grade or so, I said subtle.
Mm. Before we wrap up, because we are really approaching the end of our show, is there anything else that our listeners really need to know about Total? Additional things that are worth mentioning?
Yes, I would like to know where the name came from myself. If you have like little toddlers running around at home, or what were you trying to emphasize with that name?
I do. Well, I don't actually have a toddlers right now. I've got a 6-year-old and a 3-month old. So I've got on either side. Um, but well, the name is my wife came up with that. I am not sure I entirely understand why it's called Toddle, but when she suggested it, everyone liked it, and eventually I sort of felt powerless to do anything about it. And now I've kind of grown to like it. Like it's sort of just become, when you name something long enough, right? Eventually, anything else sounds weird.
Anymore, it's the epitome of a great name. I mean, epitome. Sorry.
It is. Yeah.
So while we've been talking, I've been playing around with this thing, and I got into the calculator app because I figured, okay, that's going to be simple programming. I'll be able to understand. And I actually don't I fundamentally don't get how this is working. Like somewhere very well, I guess I'd have to go through the tutorial. But I just opened up the example app and I go and I click on the equals button and I look at the click action and I can see there's the flow chart just going down. And it sets result to 0, which seems weird because I'd want it to set the result of whatever the previous operations were put together. It sets the operator to nothing, and then it sets the current value to 0. That's not my experience. When I click on 2 plus 2 equals, I get 4, not 0. So is there how what's the paradigm here, or the thing that I need to know to make this work from a brain?
I think this is less of a Toddle thing, and just like I had a really weird idea in my head about how the data model for calculator should be.
Oh, okay.
But it's
Okay.
essentially it sort of evolved because I wanted that additional features a lot of calculators have when you keep pressing equals. Like there's a lot where it sort of repeats these things.
Yeah.
Uh, so I ended sort of doing a few versions of that, and I think this was sort of what I came up with was a smart way of, in a relatively minimal way, to store this. Um, but yeah, I don't think that it's not so much a Toddle thing as it's just. I mean, I would have probably done the same thing in code had I been in the same mindset at that point.
Well, I see where it sets the variable, but I don't see where it actually carries out the actions. Like where is the logic stored in this thing?
So the logic is usually stored in the formulas, right?
Let me
That's
let me
usually where you compute the values.
let me check and see, because I don't see it,
But
ironically.
until AJ finds it, anything else, Andres, that you want to
I
mention
think
about Total?
Yeah, I think one thing that's because we've been talking very much developer focused on this podcast, but one of the really nice benefits of Toddle, and actually one of the main things that we found out we were solving here is that in a traditional setup, especially when you work on the front end, we sort of end up having like an assembly line of usually a product manager that feeds a idea for a feature to a designer that then builds a design and feeds it to developer that then goes to a QA. And then all of this goes back and forth in certain circles depending on how many people get back in the iterations, right? It rarely ever goes once. And even though we do say agile a lot, and we love saying agile, all of us, I think, it's still kind of an assembly line, right? It still kind of follows this flow quite often. And one of the things we really found about Toddle that was quite unique is that everyone in our company are building in Toddle, right? So my co-founder is a designer, and he's not. I mean, he's now very capable in Toddle and can do quite a complex logic, but he doesn't like to do it, so he rarely does, right? Um, he'll just work on the design, and the fact that we can build in the same platform, and it's not like a handoff where he first does all the visual design in Figma and then shows me a picture of an UI, and now can you go and build it from scratch, right? But actually, just he'll just build it, and if he needs help with the logic, I can step in, fix that. Um, or I'll build something and it'll look absolutely horrible, which actually happens a lot. And then he'll just go in after and make it look like what it should look like. And the fact that we don't have to work in serial but can work in parallel for this has been an incredible speed boost.
I,
And it's not just us. Like our new head of marketing is like building our partnership platform in Toddle because he didn't want to, like, we were doing other things, right? And this was important, so it was better he just did it.
an interesting point here. There, there are a growing number of solutions out there that are implementing some mechanism of taking Figma and translating it into code. So that step seems to be, I wouldn't quite call it solved, but much easier than it used to be. So it's much less about the process of here's a Figma drawing or whatever, now recreate it in code. You can get the initial code very often these days, or at least something that you can start from. What is missing from my perspective, and I think that Toddle is a very interesting solution here, is the other way around. I mean, that Figma to code is kind of a one time thing. You can't really take the code and the changes you've made in the code and then take it back into Figma. And so it's like one shot. And if the designer then wants to make a change, the process needs to kind of happen again in a lot of ways, or it becomes a very manual process then. And what's really great about the solutions like Toddle is that they kind of, this throwing things over the wall doesn't exist. It's the same. It's a single tool that handles the entire flow. So yeah, for sure, I see a lot of value
Yeah.
there.
And it's not just designers, right? Like if a product manager goes in and says like, why on earth is this text there? This is not descriptive. Oh, this doesn't make any sense, right? This is the worst way of explaining this feature. They can just go and fix it, right? And it doesn't break everything. It doesn't like it's not going to automatically not compile because they're changing text or they're changing an image, and that's really easy to do, right? So like a lot of time making a change in Toddle is as easy as making a Jira ticket for that change. And then you can just not do that. And that the amount of speed and velocity you get from that is unlike anything I've seen before.
Hmm.
And Toddle right now is a 5-person company that are building a no-code platform or a visual development platform for building this. Right, it's not an easy problem to solve, and the reason why we can do that is because we can be incredibly efficient with our time by actually using Toddle to ship this one.
Okay, I think we're more or less hitting the end of our show. So before we go to picks, if people want to contact you, Andres, to you know learn more about Toddle, try it out, discuss your thoughts and ideas about no code and stuff like that. What's the best way to reach you and discuss these things with you?
So they can definitely find me on Twitter. I'm quite a lot on there. My Twitter handle is Colorfit, which is a character from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but I spelled his name wrong. So maybe we'll add it in a note somewhere. But they can also find both me and everything about on toddle.dev. There's a lot of links to both Twitter and social platforms and
And,
find us through.
and Toddle, maybe we should have said it up front, is TODDLE.dev.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously it will be in the show notes and the episode title and whatnot. Um, okay, then I think it's time to push on into picks. So who wants to start? AJ, you want to go first this time?
Sure. Okay, let's see. What have I got to pick here? Um, I watched the movie A Man Called Otto with Tom Hanks, and I have mixed feelings about it.
You and me both.
So it started out so hilarious, and then about halfway through the movie, it kind of switched from being a comedy to being the message. And I, yeah. And then I started to feel like I was getting preached to. And so the ending, I just felt like they ruined it. They had such a strong comedy, and then but they had to make sure that I got the message. They could have just had the elements that they had without explicitly telling us that, men are stupid nitwits, and like it got weird. It got weird somewhere between halfway through and 3/4 through. And but I think I'd still recommend it because the first half was so good. I mean, just the opening scene was comic gold. Comic gold. He's buying a length of rope
Oh,
at
right.
the hardware store,
Right.
and they won't sell him 5 feet of rope because the computer system doesn't have a way to. It's just, yeah. And he's like, you mean to tell me the computer can't do math on 5 feet? Anyway, it just, so for me, and being a grumpy old man myself, I loved it. It was just so good. And until he got to the part where he's got a really weird relationship with his neighbor who is married and has a husband, and yet he and her are going on dates, and this.
No, I didn't see it that way. I thought that part was pretty good
Oh,
above
okay.
board. But yeah, that
Well,
scene in the store reminds me of the Father of the Bride with Steve Martin, where he goes to the store and he's raging about how there's so many buns in a hot dog package, but there's more hot dogs in a package than there are buns in a package, and he's taking out and
yeah,
gets
yeah.
thrown in jail because of his rampage at the store.
Yeah. So that anyway, so I still recommend it. I just wish they would have just kept the comic tone the whole way through, rather than switching over to just, I don't know, whatever it was towards the end there. Um, but then let's see. Other than that, I had something I was gonna pick, and I don't remember what it is. So we'll I'll pick the Super Mario Brothers movie as well. Oh no, wait, there was the Prime Again. He did something. Oh, now I remember. Jonathan Blow. So the Primeagen. I keep on saying it wrong. I'm sorry. My apologies to the Prime. I watched a video of his where he did a reaction to Jonathan Blow, but he didn't actually watch the full Jonathan Blow video. Jonathan Blow is another crotchety old man that I would just get along with swimmingly, I am sure. And his talk, the full one, was the snippet was being reacted to, is called "Preventing the Collapse of Civilization," and there was some pure comic gold in this as well. But he talks about how we have all these records of civilizations with ancient mysteries that we can't unravel, or we know a process by which it works or how it works, but we don't know how to reproduce it. And he talked about how software engineering may be in one of these peaks of civilization before the decline, where the wisdom of the ancients is lost, and then people aren't able to you got to watch the talk, actually. I'm not doing it justice, and I'm making it sound probably more complicated and stupid, but it was super entertaining, great history lesson, and some good laughs. And now I've been watching some of Jonathan Blow's other stuff, and he's based, as they say. So Jonathan Blow.
By the way, people are saying that, archaeologists are saying that our era is very problematic, that we're probably not going to leave any records behind because everything is digital. So, uh, in 1,000 years, there'll be nothing left that's readable or accessible from this era. Uh,
And that's what kind of makes us think, maybe the Egyptians did have supercomputers. Maybe AI generated the pyramids.
yeah. Okay, moving on. Steve, what about you?
Let's see. I actually have a couple picks before we get to the high point of the episode, which is my dad jokes. If you didn't know that, Andreas. So first of all, AJ made a comment that reminds me of one of my uh, favorite XKCD cartoons called "Wisdom of the Ancients," and I think about it often. Um, and it basically shows it says, "Never have I felt so close to another soul and yet so helplessly alone as when I Google an error and there's one result, a thread by someone with the same problem and no answer, last posted in 2003." And it shows the guy shaking his computer
Who
monitor
are
and
you,
screaming.
Denver Coder
Yes.
1203? What
No,
did you see?
it's Denver Coder 9, actually.
Oh,
Where were
sorry,
you,
Denver
Denver Coder
Coder.
9? What did you see? And I've actually used that comic in the past, like where I have posted a question like on Stack Overflow and never got an answer, and I'll come back and say, in order to avoid being this guy, and put a link to this cartoon, and then I'll provide my answer. So
God
it's
bless
a
you.
it's a great cartoon. It's not quite as good as Nerd Sniping or Bobby Tables in my estimation of XKCD cartoons, but it's one of the best.
Those
Or
are the classics.
or the pseudo make me a sandwich. That's the other one. Anyway, and then a definite highbrow piece of something to pick is an ad I happen to see on Twitter. Normally, I can't stand ads on Twitter and just get past them. But this is a very effective tool made by a company called, I don't know how you say it, Brezk, Brezk. And it is a fart machine toy rubber. It's awesome. You just a little thing you hold in your hand, and you squeeze it, and you can guess the sound that it makes. But looks like a very amazing tool, and only $13. So if anybody's got me on
Saw
the
that
Christmas list,
ad, wasn't tempted.
oh, I was so tempted. And, well, it's funny. It reminded me also because I had a white elephant exchange at my gym here recently within the past couple weeks, and one of the things that I gave as a toy that somebody else got was a whoopee cushion. So that tells you all you need to know about my humor. Anyway, now to the
Talking about your humor.
yes. Speaking of my humor, the dad jokes of the week, and this is a Christmas themed question. What do you call a broke Santa Claus?
I
Saint
don't know.
Nicholas. Get it? No. So, oh, and by the way, I did figure out how to upload sound effects. I just got to get it done, so I will have the rim shots back for those who enjoy that. Number two, a Roman walks into a bar, holds up two fingers, and says, "I'll have 5 beers, please." You know, 5. Funny.
Okay. Okay,
And
that's a
then
good one.
if you've ever seen Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1, he's got all the visual gags throughout all his movies like this, and there's one of them is the X and V cent store, the 5 and 10 or the
What
V
I
and X.
remember is that it's good to be the king.
Yes, it's good to be the king. I think Patrick Stewart used the same thing in one of the Robin Hood Men in Tights when he kisses Maid Marian. It's good to be the king. And then finally, question. So how can a room full of married people be empty? Because there's not a single person in it. Anyway, those are my
Okay.
picks.
Okay, so now it's my turn before we hand it over to you, Andreas. Sorry. So if you have a few moments more to think about what you want to pick. So I usually pick something about the war in Israel and Ukraine and depress everybody. So instead, I won't talk about it that much. I just mentioned that I tweeted something in kind of a relation to that, which is one of my tweets that got the most likes ever. I think it got something like 1,900 likes, which is a lot for me. Which is somebody tweeted that a stupid statement uh, that that Jesus was Palestinian. Now, you can be in favor of the Palestinians on this side of the debate. You can be in favor of Israelis. You can, in fact, be in favor of both sides, which what is what I kind of try to be, especially when I'm in a giving mood. But don't try to rewrite history, please. You
Yes.
know, Jesus was a Jewish man living in a kingdom of Judea
Yes. The term
under
Palestinian hadn't even been created
well
yet and wouldn't be
well
for a
that's
couple
not
centuries.
that's kind of true. There was it's not exactly 100% true. I mean, the Greeks living there did use the term Palestine or Philistine as a way to refer to the coastal region, but the province wasn't called Palestine until about a century and a half later. Anyway, so I tweeted that and I got a lot of likes for that. So whoopee for me about that. By
The
the way,
ratio on that tweet was epic too.
yeah. The other thing is that I really like the community notes feature. I mean, I'm critical of a lot of things that Elon Musk does and did and whatnot, but the community notes are a great addition to Twitter, I think.
Yes.
It or X or whatever it's called these days, because it makes a huge difference about these sort of things, and in this case as well. I mean, people put, after I wrote my tweet, people put a community note in there that basically said something along the same lines, and it's really, I've yet to see a community note which I really objected to. Let's put it this way. Most of them have been really on point. Um, anyway, so and my final pick is we've watched the series on TV, which unfortunately turns out it's going to have this only one season. It wasn't continued, but we really enjoyed it. It's called Lucky Hank. It's with Bob Odenkirk, who might be, very familiar from his roles on, on Breaking Bad, and on ah what's it
Better Call
uh,
Saul.
Better Call Saul, exactly. I was having, like, my brain froze. And he plays the department chairman of the of the English department in this, like, small college, and it's like a comedy drama, and we enjoyed it a lot. And unfortunately, like I said, it's not going to be continued for a second season, but I still really recommend watching this, and we enjoyed it. So those would be my picks. And do you have any picks for us,
Y-
Andreas?
Yes, I do actually have a couple picks. I think the first one, since we had a movie as the first pick, I want to add one in. I just finished watching The Last Action Hero with my wife. Not
Hmm.
exactly a recent movie, but she hadn't seen it before, and I gotta say, I think that's a classic that still holds up. So that's gonna be my first pick.
I can still
Good old
remember the
proper.
ads for that when that movie first came out, and they had 2 voice actors doing spoofs of Stallone and Schwarzenegger, and, the one line I always remember for this is, "Yeah, more like Last Action Zero," Stallone making fun of Schwarzenegger, but, yeah, that brings back some memories.
Excellent. Just sneaking another dad joke in like that. That's masterfully done, by the way.
Oh, thank you, lots of practice, but that was I can't take credit because that was actually a line from the ad, but it was still a good one.
Fair enough. But yeah, I think that one still holds up in my book. The other thing is a little bit on topic, actually. It's a talk. You can find it on YouTube by a guy called Brett Victor, who for studying different kinds of user interfaces and different kinds of ways we interact with computers. And he did a talk called "The Future of Programming." And the whole setting, the whole sort of theme of the talk is that he's pretending to be giving this talk, I think in 1970, something around there. It's actually in, like, I think early 2000s, but he's sort of pretending. So he brought an overhead projector on stage and he's changing all the slides and doing the whole thing, playing it along. And he's talking about that from this point in time, when computers really started to take off, and everybody could see it was going to be the future, but nobody had any idea what that future looked like. He stood there and said, "What are the predictions we're making, and what will it definitely look like?" And obviously, none of those predictions actually ended up being true. But it's a really interesting take, both in how many times people couldn't dream big enough compared to what was actually going to happen, but also how many times where we maybe settled for something that wasn't what it
Yeah.
could be, right? Like
wh-
we could
wh-
have probably had more, right? Why didn't this happen?
the interesting thing about people making predictions is that we generally take what we know and we extrapolate on it. We rarely think about, it's essentially impossible to think about the new ideas. So, like, when people in, like, the 50s imagined what our century will look like, they thought, hey, we have cars, we know about planes, so we'll probably have flying cars. But nobody thought about, I don't know, like an iPhone, because the concept just, it wasn't there. So you take the ideas that you have and you extrapolate from that. There's a famous story about, when semiconductors was starting to happen. Prior to that, they had the vacuum tubes, before they had the semiconductors and transistors. And one of the scientists was actually asked, how small would the single bit get, or would the and he said, as small as possible, where you can still replace one when it burns out. Now today, obviously, we just take this entire wafer with billions of bits on it and just throw it in the garbage. But he couldn't envision that. So we kind of like stuck in the paradigms that we know. It's essentially impossible to think of an alternative paradigm.
One of the founders of the university I went to is quoted for saying flying machines that are heavier than air are impossible, which I think is very good. There's a few people that made that exact quote as well, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting statement. I saw an interesting talk about it where the point of the speaker was is that they should have known it was possible because they could have opened the window and looked at birds. So if birds can do it, then it's theoretically possible to build a machine that can do it. But which is his argument why self-driving cars are eventually bound to happen. I mean, that if people can do it, we can eventually be able to build a machine that does it. Anyway, I think that more or less concludes our episode for today. So, Andres, thank you very much for coming on and telling and explaining Toddle to us and telling us about it. It's very, very interesting project and a very interesting take. And I highly recommend for our listeners to check it out. And that's it. Bye, everybody.